The boy remembered the weight of it more than anything else. He was perhaps 10 years old or near enough. The records do not specify. And the woman had handed him a black bag at the riverside and told him to carry it to the bridge. He did what he was asked. Children in Richmond in 1879 did what adults told them to do, particularly adults who seemed certain of themselves. And this woman was always certain. What he recalled, when he recalled it at all, was that the bag was heavier than it should have been, heavier than laundry, heavier than coal. He asked her what was inside it. She said it was nothing important. He carried it to the bridge. She took it from him at the railing. He did not look over the side. He was given nothing for his trouble, no coin, no word of thanks, and he walked back the way he came. It would be some months before anyone told him what he had carried. To understand what Kate Webster did in the last week of March 1879, it helps to understand what she was before it, not because her history explains the act, but because the record contains it, and what the record contains deserves to be spoken plainly. She was born Catherine Webster in County Wexford, Ireland, in or around 1849, the parish register offering only approximate certainty. She came to England as a young woman, possibly in the late 1860s, and what followed was the kind of life that leaves traces in police ledgers rather than in letters or diaries. Theft, mainly. Petty larceny across several counties. She had served at least 4 prison sentences before the age of 30. The exact number depends on which court records you consult, and they do not always agree with each other. She was physically strong. Several witnesses at the later trial would comment on this without being asked, as though it were the thing they most needed to say about her. Strong hands, strong arms, a solid, compact build. She was also, by several accounts, possessed of considerable social ease when she chose to deploy it, capable of presenting herself with enough confidence to be taken temporarily for what she was not. She had a son. His name and his father's name do not appear with consistency in any record examined here, and Kate herself was not forthcoming on the subject. The boy seems to have been cared for, at times, by relatives in Ireland. At other times he was with her. What that life looked like, a child in tow through a sequence of domestic service positions, moving from one county to the next whenever a situation ended badly, can only be inferred from the shape of the record, rather than from any direct account. She arrived at 2 Vine Cottages, Park Road, Richmond-upon-Thames, in January 1879. The woman who had hired her was named Julia Martha Thomas. Mrs. Thomas was 55 years old and had been a widow for some years, though the exact date of her husband's death is not recorded in the sources most relevant here. She lived alone in a small terraced house that smelled in winter of coal smoke and damp plaster, the kind of cold that settles in Victorian brick and does not fully leave until April. She was known in the neighborhood as a church-going woman. She attended service at the Richmond Parish Church on Sundays and was regarded as respectable, if somewhat reserved, frugal, careful with money in a way that her neighbors noticed and her servants reportedly found exhausting. She had difficulty keeping domestic help. This is documented not through her own words, which are largely absent from the historical record. She left no diary, no sustained correspondence that has survived, but through the number of positions Kate Webster had already left or been dismissed from before landing at Vine Cottages. Mrs. Thomas had placed and removed several servants in the preceding years. The reasons given varied. The pattern did not. What drew her to Kate Webster specifically is not known. Perhaps the references were adequate. Perhaps she was simply the applicant available at the moment the position needed filling. What is recorded is that by late January 1879, Kate Webster was installed at Vine Cottages as housekeeper and general domestic servant, and that the arrangement was, from nearly its first days, a troubled one. The friction between them takes on a particular quality when you read the surviving accounts, not the dramatic friction of open confrontation, but the slow, grinding kind. Mrs. Thomas was exacting. She inspected Kate's work and found it wanting. She commented on the quality of the cleaning, the preparation of meals, the management of household accounts. Kate, by her own later account and by the accounts of those who knew her in this period, did not receive criticism with equanimity. She was always finding fault, Kate would say later. The specific word she used was fault, and it appears in more than one version of her account, which suggests it was the word that had lodged itself, the word that, when she returned to those weeks in her memory, was the one that came first. Whether Mrs. Thomas's criticism was fair cannot now be determined. What can be said is that by March 1879, the situation had deteriorated to the point where Mrs. Thomas had decided to dismiss Kate Webster from her service. She had given notice. The date of departure was set for the 28th of the month. Kate Webster knew she was losing the position. She also knew, from her record, that losing a position under difficult circumstances made the next one harder to obtain. References matter in domestic service. The difference between a good character and a poor one was, in practical terms, the difference between employment and the workhouse. Kate had no savings to speak of. She had a child to support at some remove. She had, as she would later describe it, nowhere else to go. What happened on the evening of Sunday, the 2nd of March, 1879, is reconstructed primarily from Kate Webster's own accounts, and she gave several across time, not all of them consistent in detail. The consistent elements are these. There was an argument. It escalated. Mrs. Thomas was at the top of the stairs when it turned physical. She fell, or was pushed. The record contains both possibilities, and Kate's own accounts are not reliable enough to settle the question. What is not disputed is that Julia Martha Thomas died in that house on that evening, and that Kate Webster was the only other person present. The house was quiet after, the kind of quiet that settles in rooms where something has permanently altered. The coal fire in the parlor was still burning. Somewhere outside, the Thames moved in the dark. What Kate Webster did in the days that followed was not planned. This is important, and it is something the trial record implicitly supports, even if the prosecution did not emphasize it. The disposal was improvised. The cover-up was made up as she went. There was no prepared method, no pre-acquired materials, no evidence of forethought. What there was, instead, was a practical problem, a very large, very immediate, very concrete problem, and a woman who, under pressure, defaulted to action rather than collapse. She had tools in the house, a copper boiler in the kitchen, the kind used for laundry, capable of sustained high heat, a kitchen knife, a meat saw. These were standard items in a Victorian domestic kitchen. Their presence requires no explanation beyond that. She began on the Monday. What she did over the following days is stated plainly in the trial testimony, and I will state it plainly here, because the record contains it, and because euphemism in this instance would be a form of dishonesty. She dismembered the body of Julia Martha Thomas, and she used the copper boiler to reduce portions of the remains. The process took several days. The house on Park Road, Richmond, would have smelled, during this period, of things that neighbors might have attributed to cooking, or to rendering fat, which was a common domestic practice, the processing of animal fats into dripping or tallow, for use in cooking and for sale. Whether the neighbors noticed any smell is not established in the records I have reviewed. What is established is that no one knocked on the door. No one asked questions. The house kept its silence, and Kate Webster worked. She packed the remains into boxes and bags. A wooden box. A black bag. The black bag. She disposed of them over the course of several days, using the Thames as the principal means of dispersal. The river had been disposing of London's unwanted things for centuries, and it did not distinguish. Body parts recovered later, a torso, a foot, a hand, were found at Twickenham, downstream, washed up on the bank near a coal wharf, where two boys discovered them on the morning of the 5th of March. The foot was later identified by a surgeon as belonging to a woman of approximately Mrs. Thomas's age and build. The identification was considered probable rather than certain. DNA science was not available. The surgeons worked from what they could see. The head, the skull, was not found with the rest. Kate Webster, by her own later account, threw it separately. A different location, a different night. The head, she said, she put into a black bag and disposed of elsewhere. Exactly where, the record does not confirm, and Kate herself gave differing accounts at different times, which may indicate deliberate concealment or may indicate that the details of those nights had blurred in a mind under extraordinary stress. What is certain is that the skull was not recovered in 1879, it was not recovered in 1880, or in 1900, or in 1950. It was not recovered for 131 years. Now to the fat. This is the element of the Kate Webster case that distinguished it from other Victorian murder cases, the element that made it, when it emerged at trial, the thing that reporters reached for first when they were trying to convey the nature of what had happened. It appeared in the testimony of a neighbor, the specific details are contained in the Old Bailey records, that during the days following Mrs. Thomas's death, Kate Webster had offered to neighbors in the immediate vicinity of Vine cottages containers of what she described as dripping. Dripping, rendered animal fat, used for cooking, used to fry bread, used to add flavor to boiled vegetables, was a standard commodity in working-class Victorian households. A servant who had rendered a quantity of it might reasonably offer the surplus to neighbors. There was nothing unusual in the offer itself. The neighbors, the record suggests, received it. Whether they used it is not stated in any source I have found. The testimony establishes the offer, establishes the receipt, and stops there. The silence that follows that stopping point is one that the court, having established the relevant facts, did not need to fill. The jury filled it themselves, as every person who has subsequently read the case fills it themselves, in the same appalling moment of comprehension. The prosecution at trial framed this element with deliberate restraint. They stated the testimony. They allowed it to exist in the courtroom without elaboration. It was sufficient. It has always been sufficient. I will not elaborate further. I will only note that this is the moment in the Kate Webster case where the horror is not in the act, the violence, the dismemberment, but in the casual domesticity of what came after. The fire, the copper pot, the jars lined up in a kitchen that smelled of rendered fat, and something else underneath it, something that the neighbors, passing by, could not quite name. On the 9th of March, 1 week after Julia Martha Thomas died, Kate Webster walked to the house of a man named John Church. John Church ran a public house in Richmond. He was known to Kate Webster through prior acquaintance, the precise nature of which the record presents with some ambiguity. What is unambiguous is the purpose of her visit. She told him she was the owner of 2 Vine cottages, Park Road, that the house was hers, that she wished to sell it, and that she would be grateful for his assistance in finding a buyer. She was wearing Mrs. Thomas's clothes. The clothes are documented in witness testimony, and they are an important detail not because they were the thing that ultimately unraveled the deception. They were not, but because of what they represent in the larger shape of the case. Kate Webster had, by this point, moved fully into the space that Julia Martha Thomas had occupied. She was wearing her employer's dress. She was using her employer's name. She was sleeping in her employer's bed, eating from her employer's pantry, sitting in her employer's parlor. The household effects, the furniture, the china, the small accumulated possessions of a woman who had lived frugally, but lived, were now being inventoried and considered for sale. She had not so much escaped the situation as she had stepped into it, absorbed it, walked forward wearing another woman's silhouette. John Church, for his part, was not immediately suspicious. He was, or presented himself as, cooperative. He agreed to look at the property. He came to Vine Cottages and walked through the rooms. He spoke with Kate Webster about the contents, the lease, the possible price. He addressed her as Mrs. Thomas. She answered to it. The furniture is good quality, she told him, according to the account he later gave. The house is well situated. I am anxious to be rid of it quickly, as I intend to return to Ireland. The detail about Ireland was perhaps a mistake, or perhaps not a mistake, but a truth that slipped in where fiction was intended. She was Irish. She had family in Ireland. The idea of returning, of going back to a place where no one in Richmond would think to look, would have had a certain logical appeal. Church, in his account, said he found her composed, decisive. He began to make inquiries about a buyer. There is a man in this story who appears only briefly, but whose presence carries weight disproportionate to his role in the legal proceedings. His name was Henry Porter, and he was a boy, 10 years old approximately, the son of a neighbor. And he is the boy from the opening of this account, the boy who carried the bag. What is recorded about Henry Porter beyond this single act is very little. He lived nearby. He knew Kate Webster by sight, which is to say he knew her in the way that children in Victorian terraced streets knew the adults around them, as presences, as figures associated with particular houses and particular routines. She had spoken to him before. She was evidently someone he trusted enough to do what she asked. She gave him the black bag on the evening of the 5th of March. It was, by the trial testimony and by Henry's own account, very heavy. He asked what was inside. She said it was nothing important. He carried it to the bridge over the Thames and returned it to her at the railing, and she threw it, or its contents, the account varies, into the river below. He was 10 years old. He did not know what he was helping to move. He did as he was told, as 10-year-old boys in Richmond in 1879 did what they were told, and he walked home, and he did not think about it, or not at least, in a way that reached anyone who wrote it down, until the police came asking. When he was asked later whether the bag had smelled of anything, he said he thought it had. He could not describe the smell precisely. It was not a smell he had encountered before. He had thought at the time that perhaps something had spoiled. Meat, perhaps. He had not dwelled on it. He was 10. The investigation began not through any brilliant detective work. The record does not support that framing, but through the slow accumulation of small irregularities that, taken together, could not be explained by coincidence. The torso and limbs found at Twickenham on the 5th of March had been logged, examined, and set aside as an unidentified drowning case with unusual circumstances. Victorian coroners dealt with the Thames regularly. It yielded the drowned and the disposed with equal indifference. What shifted the attention was the box. A wooden box containing further remains was recovered from the Thames at Barnes, downstream from Richmond, upstream from Twickenham. A coal porter named Henry Wheatley found it. The box was addressed. The address was not Mrs. Thomas's address, and the story of how it came to be addressed at all is one of those details in the Kate Webster case that suggests, again, the improvised quality of the cover-up. She had used a box that was already to hand. It bore markings she had not removed. Investigators, working backwards from the box, arrived at Richmond. Inquiries in Richmond about residents unaccounted for led quickly to Vine Cottages. The neighbors there had noticed that Mrs. Thomas had not been seen in some days. They had, however, seen a woman coming and going from the house, a woman in Mrs. Thomas's clothes, carrying herself with what one neighbor described as great confidence, which is a phrase that appears in the contemporary press coverage and which, in context, carries a particular irony. A police constable knocked on the door of 2 Vine Cottages on the 18th of March. Kate Webster was not there. She had gone. She had taken what she could carry and what she thought would not be missed, and she had left Richmond. She went to Ireland. She went to Enniscorthy, County Wexford, the county of her birth, and she stayed with relatives whose precise relationship to her is not fully established in the sources. She had her son with her, or collected him from whoever had been caring for him. She presented herself to those who did not know her history as a woman recently returned from service in England, widowed, perhaps, or simply done with London. The story was flexible. She had practice at flexibility. She had also, before leaving Richmond, written to John Church, The letter asked him to continue his inquiries about selling the house. She signed it with a name that was not her own. Whether Church was by this point genuinely uncertain of the situation, or whether he had begun to suspect it and was proceeding carefully, is something the record does not resolve with full clarity. What is documented is that he continued to act on the letter, to make inquiries, and that this brought him into contact with people who were, by this point, increasingly interested in the whereabouts of Mrs. Thomas. When the police contacted Church, his account was cooperative and prompt. He told them everything he knew, the woman presenting herself as Mrs. Thomas, the house, the furniture, the request for a buyer. He described her. He described the clothes she had been wearing. Mrs. Thomas's clothes, identifiable because Mrs. Thomas's neighbors recognized them when Church described them. A warrant was issued. The name on the warrant was Kate Webster. The address was Enniscorthy, County Wexford. She was arrested on the 29th of March, 1879, at the house of her relatives by members of the Irish Constabulary acting in cooperation with the Metropolitan Police. The arrest was made in the early morning. The accounts of what she said at the moment of arrest differ in their particulars, but agree on the essential point. She did not, at first, acknowledge who she was. "My name is Webster," she finally said, when the constable pressed her. "Kate Webster." The pause before it, whatever length it was, belongs to the record. She was transported back to England and held on remand while the investigation continued. The trial at the Old Bailey opened on the 2nd of July, 1879, before Mr. Justice Denman. She pleaded not guilty. The case against her was, in evidentiary terms, substantial. The remains recovered from the Thames, the torso, the limbs, portions of a foot, were identified by surgeons as consistent with a woman of Mrs. Thomas's approximate age. Items from the house at Vine Cottages had been sold or moved. A coal porter's evidence established the box. Henry Porter gave his testimony about the bag. His account, as read in the trial transcript, is notable for its brevity and its directness. He was not a dramatic witness. He said what had happened. He said the bag was heavy. He said she told him it was nothing important. He said he carried it to the bridge. The jury spent very little time deliberating. The verdict was guilty. The sentence was death. She was to be hanged on the 29th of July, 1879, at Wandsworth Prison. In the days between sentencing and execution, Kate Webster asked to make a statement. She had, at various points in the proceedings, given differing accounts of what had happened on the 2nd of March, what she had done, how it had begun, whether she had intended what she had done, or whether the evening's violence had been something she had not planned and could not fully account for, even to herself. Her statements were not consistent. They were not, perhaps, intended to be. She was a woman who had spent her adult life managing the gap between what was and what needed to appear to be, and old habits, even at the last, are difficult to set down. Her final confession, made to the prison chaplain, was recorded in summary rather than verbatim, a fact that is itself a kind of loss, because the verbatim voice of Kate Webster, when it appears in the trial record, has a quality that summaries cannot preserve. She was, in her own way, articulate. She could make you believe her, or at least make you understand how other people had. What the summary records is this: she admitted to the killing. She said the argument on the stairs had gone further than she had intended. She said that what followed, the days after, had felt, as she experienced them, less like decisions than like the carrying out of what had already, by some terrible logic, been set in motion. She could not, she said, go back. She could only go forward. The chaplain recorded that she showed what he described as appropriate remorse. Whether that phrase means what it appears to mean, or whether it is the kind of phrase a prison chaplain reaches for when the truth is more complicated, cannot now be determined. She was hanged on the 29th of July, 1879. The executioner was William Marwood. She was the last woman to be publicly. The record is not precise on this point. In any case, she died within the walls of Wandsworth and was buried on the grounds in an unmarked grave, as was then the practice for the executed. She was 30 years old, perhaps 31. The parish register remains imprecise on this point, as on several others. The house at 2 Vine Cottages, Park Road, Richmond, stood for many years after. It was rented and re-rented, occupied by families who may or may not have known its history, or who knew it and made their peace with it in the way that people make their peace with houses that have contained difficult things. The Thames continued to move past Richmond, through Twickenham, under the bridges, to the sea, as it always had. Julia Martha Thomas had no children. Her estate, such as it was small, the contents of a modestly furnished house occupied by a woman who had lived carefully and spent little. The frugality that had made her a difficult employer had not, in the end, accumulated into anything substantial. There was furniture, there was china, there were clothes, the clothes that Kate Webster had worn, that the neighbors had recognized. There were, presumably, other small things, the things that constitute a life, correspondence, perhaps, or a prayer book with a name written inside it, objects that meant something to the woman who had arranged them on shelves and mantelpieces and window-sills over years of solitary habitation. What became of these objects after the house was cleared and let again is not recorded. Mrs. Thomas left no diary. She left no substantial letters. She appears in the historical record almost entirely in relation to her death, as the body in the copper boiler, as the clothing on another woman's back, as the name Kate Webster used when speaking to men about property values. She is, in the archive, almost entirely constructed from the shape of what was done to her. There is something in that which the record cannot quite correct for, no matter how careful the reconstruction. Henry Porter lived. He grew up in Richmond, insofar as the records are traceable, and what became of him in adulthood is not established in the sources I have reviewed. He would have been in his early 40s at the turn of the century. He would have been alive, in all likelihood, when the newspapers revisited the case on various anniversaries, as newspapers do. Whether he read those accounts, whether he thought, on reading them, about the weight of the bag, the smell he could not quite name, the woman who stood at the railing and told him to go home, is not something any record contains. He was 10 years old. He did what he was asked. The skull was not found in 1879. It was not found in the years after the trial, when the case was discussed and dissected in the press, when Kate Webster became one of those Victorian murderesses whose names persist in criminological literature and in the more morbid corners of historical memory. It was not found in the 20th century, in any of the numerous excavations and constructions that reshaped Richmond as it reshaped itself, decade by decade across the river's long patience. In 2010, a construction crew working on renovations at a public house in Richmond, a public house that had stood, in some form or other, near the river for many years, broke ground and found some feet below the surface a human skull. The skull was examined by forensic scientists. It was identified, with the confidence available to modern forensic analysis, as belonging to a woman of approximately 50 to 60 years of age, dating to the Victorian period. The location, the age, the period, the proximity to the known disposal route. The forensic report did not make the identification absolute. It could not. What it did was establish, with the weight of multiple converging factors, that the skull found beneath a Richmond pub in 2010 was in all probability what remained of Julia Martha Thomas, the part of her that Kate Webster had separated from the rest and disposed of apart in a different bag, on a different night, in a different stretch of river or riverbank or disturbed earth somewhere in Richmond, where it had lain for 131 years, while the city built itself up around it and the Thames kept moving. The skull is now held as evidence. or in the language that institutions use when evidence becomes something older than the case it belongs to, it is preserved. It is in someone's care. That, at least, is something. Kate Webster had, in those weeks after the 2nd of March, worn Julia Martha Thomas's clothes, used her name, sat in her chair, offered her fat to the neighbors, and attempted to sell her house. The legal language for what she was charged with was murder. The charge was accurate. It was also, in a sense, insufficient. She did not simply kill her employer. She stepped into the empty space and wore it. She made herself, for a matter of weeks, the living continuation of a woman she had extinguished, answering to her name, moving through her rooms, presenting her possessions as though they had always been hers. The erasure was not incidental to the crime. It was the cover-up's central logic. If there was no Mrs. Thomas, there was no Kate Webster to account for. The plan failed as improvised plans tend to fail through accumulation. A box with markings she had not removed, a neighbor who noticed the clothes, a coal porter who remembered a face, a boy who remembered the weight of a bag. But it nearly worked. For 17 days, from the 2nd to the 18th of March, Kate Webster moved through Richmond-upon-Thames as Julia Martha Thomas, and no one conclusively knew the difference. 17 days. The skull lay under the pub for 131 years, and the Thames went on, and the city went on, and nothing marked the place, until someone broke the ground and found what was waiting there, patient in the dark, 30 feet from the river that had taken the rest.